January 3rd, 1945. Wyoming Winter Trainin' Grounds. The blizzard swallowed the horizon whole, a white wall roaring across the plains with a force that felt almost biblical. Snow didn't fall in flakes. It came in waves, horizontal and violent, stinging the skin like shards of glass. Within minutes, the world narrowed to an arm's length of swirling white, and even the dark silhouettes of the pine line vanished into nothingness. 12 German women, thin, exhausted, wrapped in threadbare Luftwaffe auxiliary coats, struggled forward in a crooked line behind the stalled convoy. The trucks had made it halfway up the ridge before the engines coughed, sputtered, and died in the cold. One vehicle had slid sideways off the icy road, its axle snapping with a crack that disappeared into the roar of the wind. There was no repairing anything in this storm. Marching was the only option left. Sergeant Thomas Hale wiped frost from his eyelashes and shouted over the wind, "Stay tight, keep them between us." But his voice was shredded instantly, carried off into the storm as if swallowed by the sky. The women could barely hear him. Their world was wind, cold, and fear. For days they had been told they were being transferred to a larger camp. Most had believed deep down that the rumors whispered aboard the transport ship were true. Americans abandoned prisoners when conditions turned deadly. Why waste resources on the enemy? Why rescue women whose uniforms still carried the stains of bombed-out German soil? Fräulein Martha Köhler stumbled, her boots slipping on ice hidden beneath powder. She had once been a schoolteacher in Hamburg, proud and firm. Now her face was gray, her lips blue, and her legs moved without rhythm as if they no longer belonged to her. She whispered hoarsely, "They'll leave us here. They'll let the snow take us." Beside her, young Ilse Brandt, barely 19, drafted into radio service, pulled her scarf tighter. Her breath came shallow and quick. "They said the Americans were merciful," she murmured, though her voice cracked with doubt. "The others said they weren't, that they let women die." The blizzard swallowed the rest of her thought. Then it happened. Marta staggered once more, swayed, and collapsed into the snow with a soft sound that was somehow more terrifying than a scream. She didn't move. Private Everett Collins reacted first. "Man down!" he shouted out of habit, but the correction hit him a heartbeat later. "Prisoner down!" He pushed through the wind toward the fallen figure. "Keep distance," someone reminded, a rule burned into every guard's training, but rules dissolved quickly in lethal cold. Collins dropped to his knees beside Marta. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused. Frost clung to her lashes like tiny beads of glass. Her breath came in broken puffs, growing fainter each second. "She can't walk," he shouted. "She won't last 10 minutes." Lieutenant Harris pushed through the blowing snow, his face carved with decision. One look at Marta, and he tore the glove off his right hand, pressing 2 fingers against her neck. "Pulse is weak." He glanced toward the line of prisoners swaying like shadows in the storm. "Damn it! If one's going down, the others aren't far behind." Another woman slipped. Another dropped to her knees. Panic rippled through the ranks, muffled by wind but unmistakable. Private Collins looked up, snow crusting his eyebrows. "Sir, orders?" The lieutenant hesitated for half a heartbeat, then bellowed into the storm, "They'll freeze! Pick them up!" The words shot through the blizzard like a flare. Every American soldier moved at once. Training said, "Keep distance." Human instinct said, "Save them." Collins lifted Marta onto his back, her limbs limp, her breath brushing faintly against his neck. Sergeant Hale hoisted another woman, then another. Heavy coats were stripped from American shoulders and wrapped around German prisoners. Some men gave up their scarves, others their gloves. Breath steamed violently in the frozen air as the column reformed, not as guards and captives, but as bodies clustered together in a desperate march against the storm. Ilse felt a coat, thick, warm, American, draped around her shoulders. She looked up to see Corporal Jensen fastening the buttons with numb fingers. His face was red with cold, his eyes fierce with determination. "Keep close," he said. "We're getting you out of this." "Why?" she whispered, the word nearly carried away. He didn't hear her. Or maybe he did, but chose not to answer yet. The blizzard pressed harder, screaming against them, pulling at their legs. Each step felt like walking through water that wanted to freeze solid. Snow packed into boots, into collars, into mouths gasping for breath. But the soldiers pushed forward, the weight of another human being on their backs driving them into deeper resolve. To the prisoners, the realization struck slowly, then all at once. The Americans weren't leaving them to die. They were fighting the storm for them, fighting nature itself to protect the very people they had been told to fear. Hope and disbelief tangled together inside each freezing chest. Ahead, Sergeant Hale glanced back at the ghostly line. 12 German women slung over American shoulders wrapped in American coats carried by American strength. The image blurred in the wind, then sharpened with each step he forced into the snow. "Move," he barked. "Keep moving. Don't let the storm win." The column stumbled forward, disappearing inch by inch into the blizzard. From afar, if anyone had been there to see, it would have looked like 13 shadows merging with the whiteout. 12 of them, small, fragile, draped over the broad backs of men who refused to abandon them. One leading the way, carving a path through a storm that had no mercy for enemy or friend. The wind swallowed them whole, carrying them deeper into the unknown. And somewhere behind that curtain of white, an unlikely rescue of enemies had begun. The storm did not ease. If anything, it tightened its grip, as though the blizzard itself meant to test every conviction the Americans carried on their backs. And here lay the twist that no prisoner, no German officer, no propagandist back home could have predicted. The farther the soldiers pushed into the white void, the more fiercely they fought to save the very women who believed they would abandon them. It was a moment suspended in contradiction. 12 German POWs certain they were marching toward death, and a squad of American soldiers determined to prove them wrong with every shivering step. Yet the blizzard was only the surface of a much larger story, a storm shaped long before Wyoming's winds began to howl. January 1945 wasn't just cold. It was the cold hangover of a world nearly destroyed. Across Europe, the final winter of World War II had left whole continents bruised, burned, and starved. Cities that once pulsed with life, Warsaw, Cologne, Hamburg, Leipzig, had become charred skeletons. Rail lines twisted like broken ribs. Streets lay buried under bricks, smoke, and the memories of people who no longer existed. For 6 relentless years, the Third Reich had fed its citizens a singular message. The Americans are monsters. If they capture you, especially if you are a woman, they will do unspeakable things. Posters showed American soldiers as beasts. Radio broadcasts hammered the idea that surrender was worse than death. Girls barely out of school were told to carry a last bullet for themselves, should the Americans come. And yet here they were, being carried through a blizzard on American shoulders, wrapped in American coats, protected by men who had been raised on values, not vengeance. But this revelation had not yet taken full root in their minds. The propaganda lived inside them like a second heartbeat, whispering fear, mistrust, and doom into every moment of the march. The 12 women, now struggling against death, had once lived ordinary lives. Before the uniforms, before the collapse. Marta Köhler graded essays in a Hamburg classroom. Ilse Brandt learned Morse code in a cramped Berlin radio school. Greta Hoffman planned to train as a nurse until shortages pulled her into anti-aircraft duty. By late 1944, Germany was bleeding soldiers faster than it could bury them. Girls who should have been in university found themselves handling communications for collapsing front lines. Some operated radios for Luftwaffe units. Others carried messages through bomb craters. Many were swept up during chaotic retreats, captured not because they fought, but because the war devoured everyone in its path. They were far from hardened ideologues. They were simply caught in a machine too big to escape. When American forces reached the towns where they served, resistance crumbled. Officers fled. Orders vanished. These women were left with no guidance but the very propaganda that had kept them compliant. Never surrender to Americans. You will not survive. And so, as the blizzard raged around them, their terror was not irrational. It was inherited. By 1945, the United States had become the mightiest industrial force in human history. 96,000 aircraft rolled out of American factories each year. 29,000 tanks thundered into existence. 8 million tons of shipping pushed across oceans. Ford's Willow Run plant produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Women, Rosie the Riveters, riveted steel. Teenagers collected scrap metal. Farmers doubled harvests. The entire nation moved in one direction, driven by a collective belief that tyranny must be defeated. More than 12 million American men were serving across the globe, the largest mobilization the country had ever seen. And beneath the uniforms, beneath the rifles and the rations, lived an unshakable cultural code passed down through families, churches, and front porch wisdom. Do the right thing, even when no one is watching. It was a value that Nazi propaganda could never comprehend, and it was why the soldiers in Wyoming didn't let go. Hale had been raised in the cold. Nebraska winters had sculpted him. Wind-burned cheeks, steady hands, a kind of quiet toughness common among Midwestern farm boys. His father used to say, "Winter shows what a man is. Summer just lets him pretend." But it was his mother's words he carried in his breast pocket, folded inside a letter now softened by months of handling. "Remember who we are. If you come back from war with hate in your heart, son, then the world has lost twice." Those words guided him more than any military regulation could. When he looked at the German women, faces frozen, terror shining through the frost, he didn't see the enemy. He saw human beings losing to the storm. Ilsa, half-conscious on the corporal's back, replayed the propaganda reels she grew up with. Americans laughing as they threw prisoners into pits. American doctors cutting people open. American soldiers tossing women aside like objects. The reels had been absurd, grotesque, yet told with such authority that children absorbed them as truth. Now, as an American coat wrapped around her shoulders, reality bent sharply away from everything she'd believed. Marta, drifting in and out of consciousness on Private Collins' back, whispered, "Why? Why would they carry us?" Collins didn't hear her, but the storm did, and for a moment even the wind seemed to hesitate. The women marched with the ghosts of propaganda chained to their ankles. The Americans marched with generations of moral teaching pushing them forward. Fear versus duty. Lies versus legacy. Collapse versus character. The blizzard wasn't just weather. It was a crucible, melting away falsehood, stripping every human down to what they truly were. And as the column pressed deeper into the whiteout, it became clear. This night would reveal more about nations, identities, and morality than any battlefield ever could. Ahead, Sergeant Hale tightened his grip on the woman he carried, bending into the wind until his back nearly creaked. Behind him, 12 shadows clung to life on American shoulders, and the question, hanging unspoken in the frozen air, was no longer, "Will the Americans leave us to freeze?" It was becoming something else, a quiet, dawning wonder. What kind of nation risks its own for the sake of its enemies? The storm had not yet finished shaping its answer. The deeper they pushed into the storm, the more astonishing the truth became. The blizzard cared nothing for uniforms, nations, or the war that had carved the world in half. It struck Americans and Germans with the same merciless force, reducing enemies to the same trembling, frost-bitten humanity. What none of the prisoners could have imagined, what even the soldiers had not foreseen, was that surviving the night would require breaking rules older than the war itself. Snow thickened until sky and ground became the same white void. The gusts no longer felt like wind, but like a giant hand pushing them backward, threatening with every blast to fold them into the drifts and erase them. Sergeant Hale squinted through the whiteout, searching desperately for the tree line he knew lay somewhere ahead, dark pines that might shield them long enough to regroup. "Head for the ridge," he shouted, though few could hear him over the howl. Private Collins adjusted his hold on Marta, whose breathing had become faint puffs against his neck. He could feel her slipping, her weight lighter now. Too light, the way bodies feel when consciousness thins toward nothing. Behind him, the others trudged forward in ragged formation, each carrying a limp shape, each step slow as prayer. The storm struck again with a scream. Ilsa cried out as a sheet of snow slammed into her face, and Corporal Jensen nearly lost his footing. "We won't make the camp," Lieutenant Harris called, voice hoarse. "Take the woods. Move." The trees appeared suddenly, towering shadows materializing from the blizzard, branches heavy with ice, trunks dark and silent like sentinels watching from another world. The moment the group crossed beneath their canopy, wind softened just enough that men could speak without shouting. Hale scanned the forest floor. Snow lay deep, but the space between trunks offered shelter. "Dig in," he ordered. "Snow pits, now!" They set the prisoners down gently, then fell to their knees, scraping furiously at the snow with gloved hands, mess tin lids, whatever they could grab. Frost bit into fingers, but adrenaline dulled the pain. The snow was dense, packed by the storm, but beneath it lay a small hollow of still air, warmth by comparison. Collins laid, Marta inside the pit he'd carved. Her body shivered violently, then went frighteningly still. "She's losing heat fast," he murmured. Jensen knelt beside Ilsa. Her eyes fluttered open, then closed again. He slapped her lightly on the cheeks. "Stay with me, you hear? Don't fall asleep." Her lips parted, barely moving. "I'm so tired." "You sleep, you die," Jensen said, voice cracking, "and don't you dare." Lieutenant Harris tore branches from a fallen pine, his movements frantic. "We need fire, anything that burns." "Everything's wet," someone said. "Then dry it with your hands," Harris snapped. "Rub it, strip bark, just move." Soon, small piles of shaved bark and splintered twigs formed beneath shaking hands. A match finally caught, briefly flickering blue, then dying. Another scraped. This one flared, wobbling in the wind. Harris cupped it with both hands until flame licked the twigs. Smoke curled upward, thin but hopeful. "Feed it!" In minutes, a tiny fire crackled beneath the pines. Not enough to warm them all, barely enough to keep death a few steps at bay. That was when Hale saw her. Greta Hoffman, curled on her side, half buried in snow. Her fingers were pale as bone. "She's going into deep freeze," Hale said, and without hesitation he dropped to his knees and pulled her into his arms. Her skin burned with cold. Her breath ghosted against his collar, faint as a feather. "This won't hold her," he muttered, glancing at the small fire. The warmth barely reached her. Jensen heard him. "She needs core heat," he said quietly. "Direct contact." He hesitated, glancing toward the lieutenant. The rule was clear. No unnecessary physical contact with POWs, especially women. But Greta's chest rose once, then not at all. Hale didn't ask permission. He unbuttoned his coat, pressed Greta against his chest, and wrapped the coat around her body, enclosing her in the fierce, fading heat his own body could offer. "Breathe," he whispered to her. "Don't quit now." Her head rested under his chin, her frozen fingers trapped between his hands. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, air returned to her lungs. Jensen watched in stunned silence before looking back at Ilsa, who trembled in his arms. He swallowed hard, then pulled her closer to his chest and wrapped his coat around her. Ilsa gasped at the sudden warmth, clinging weakly to the fabric. It was then that Private Lawson shouted from the far side of the clearing, voice cracking with emotion. "Enemy or not, nobody dies in my watch." The words reverberated through the forest like a vow, a declaration older than any battlefield, older than the war itself. For a moment, the storm seemed to quiet, humbled by something it could not bury. They fed the fire with bark rubbed dry between palms, with twigs warmed by their breath. Smoke drifted upward in thin tendrils, disappearing into branches heavy with ice. Around the fire, Germans and Americans huddled so close their breaths mingled. The boundaries between uniforms blurred, washed out by desperation and the primitive human need for warmth. Fear softened. Suspicion melted. Even the propaganda echoing in the POWs' minds faded beneath the immediate, undeniable truth. The Americans could have let them die, but they hadn't. Hale felt Greta stir slightly. Her fingers twitched against his shirt. The relief hit him so sharply it almost hurt. "Good girl," he murmured. "Stay with us." The blizzard continued to rage beyond the tree line, but here, in the fragile sanctuary carved by exhausted hands, something else had begun to grow. Quietly, stubbornly, like a spark refusing to die. A fire too small to warm the sky, yet strong enough to challenge the storm. And in its glow, enemies breathed the same air, clung to the same hope, and realized nature had reduced them to a single truth. Out here, survival wasn't American or German. It was human. And humanity, in this moment, belonged to both sides. The fire that kept them alive through the worst hours of the storm had burned down to a trembling orange core, no larger than a cupped hand. Dawn never came, only a faint thinning of the darkness, a suggestion that somewhere above the clouds the sun still existed. The wind had not relented. It circled the pines like a hungry animal, waiting for its moment to strike again. Inside the shallow pits the soldiers had dug, the prisoners lay pressed against American chests, wrapped in American coats, clinging to warmth that wasn't theirs. No one spoke. Breath rose in pale ghosts. Frost-rimmed eyebrows, mustaches, hair. Every heartbeat sounded too loud in the silence. That was when the radio crackled to life. A thin, broken voice fought through static. "Alpha Team, do you copy? Repeat. This is Base Snowline. Rescue Team delayed. Storm impassable. You must." The rest dissolved into a hiss, then reformed in fragments. "Cannot reach you. Visibility 0. If you do not move on your own, you will not survive the next front." Lieutenant Harris lifted the radio closer to his ear. "Say again, Base. What are our orders regarding the POWs?" Another long burst of static. Then the answer, clear, cold, devastating. "Prioritize American lives. Repeat, troop safety authorized. You cannot wait. If you stay put, you freeze." A deeper voice joined in, possibly the commanding officer himself. "Lieutenant, you're permitted to leave the prisoners. That is an order backed by command authority. Godspeed." Harris lowered the radio slowly, staring at the frost creeping up its metal edge. Around him, the soldiers watched with hollowed expressions. No one breathed. Leave the prisoners. Walk away and save themselves. No court-martial. No reprimand. No questions. Just survival. Sergeant Hale felt Greta shift weakly against him. She didn't understand the radio words, but she sensed something in the sudden stillness. She opened her eyes, lids trembling, pupils dilated with fear. Ilsa, still cradled in Jensen's arms, whispered a hoarse plea. "Please, don't leave us." "Easy," Jensen murmured, though his own voice shook. He looked to Hale, then to Harris, waiting for the decision that would define their lives. Harris ran a hand over his face, dragging frost from his beard. The storm roared around them like a judge demanding an answer. He looked at the prisoners, their small frames wrapped tightly against broad American chests, and closed his eyes. He knew the protocol. He knew the math. He knew the storm would kill them all if they didn't move now. But handing down that order meant something far worse than death. It meant breaking faith with the men he led. It meant breaking faith with the country that raised them. Before he spoke, Hale pushed himself upright, still holding Greta, and faced the squad. His breath steamed in heavy bursts. His voice was rough, but steady. "They'll leave us to freeze," he said quietly. "That's what these women believe." The words fell with the weight of truth. Every prisoner flinched. Every soldier looked down. Hale tightened his grip on Greta's shoulders. "They think America's the kind of place that lets people die in the snow." He shook his head. "Not on my land. Not while I'm breathing." A moment stretched, a moment where the storm itself seemed to listen. Then his voice rose, carrying through the trees like a bell. "But we are Americans, and Americans don't abandon people." No one moved for a heartbeat. Then Private Collins stood, lifting Marta onto his back again. His knees wobbled, but he steadied himself. "Sergeant's right. We carry them." Jensen adjusted Ilsa in his arms. "I'll take her first shift. Someone relieve me after a quarter mile." "I'll take the next," Lawson said. "I don't care if my bones snap. I'm not leaving her." One by one, every soldier rose. Every man shouldered a life that moments before he had been given permission to discard. They wrapped scarves tighter, buttoned coats higher, pulled prisoners close enough to feel the weak rise and fall of their breaths. Lieutenant Harris stared at them. The men who would obey orders on any battlefield, yet now refused the one command that violated their souls. He nodded once, the motion small but resolute. "All right," he said quietly. "We move together." No one cheered. No one had the strength. But something lit behind their eyes, a flame stronger than the fire they had tended all night. They stepped out from beneath the trees into the full force of the storm. The wind slammed into them again, a wall of ice. Snow clung to boots, pulled at legs, tried to drag them under. But now each soldier carried more than weight. They carried proof, living, trembling proof of who they were. The march became a ritual of endurance. 10. Steps. Pause. Shift the weight. 10 more steps. Hale could barely feel his arms, but he kept moving. Greta's breath warmed the hollow of his collar. Each exhale reminded him why they were doing this. Behind him, Colin sang a tune under his breath, a hymn his mother used to sing while mending winter coats. It wove through the wind like a thread of home, stitching the men's courage together. The prisoners could not understand every word, but they felt the meaning. They felt the strength carrying them. They felt the truth breaking through the lies that had shaped their fear. The Americans were not leaving them to die. The Americans were not monsters. The Americans were choosing them. Hours passed, or minutes, or years. In storms like this, time became a circle. When one soldier reached exhaustion, another stepped forward, lifting the prisoner onto a fresh set of shoulders. No complaints, no hesitation. Not once did they allow a woman's body to touch the snow again. Ilsa cried softly into Jensen's coat. "Why? Why save us?" He tightened his hold. "Because no one dies on our watch. Not today. Not in this country." And somewhere inside the blizzard's roar, a strange, ancient pride stirred. Something the soldiers couldn't name, yet felt in their bones. This was the America their fathers taught them to be. This was the America their mothers prayed they would uphold. This was the America the greatest generation carried into every battlefield and every storm. In that endless white wasteland, 12 German women clung to life on American shoulders. And somewhere far from Wyoming, decades into the future, grandchildren who had never met those women would one day whisper through tears, "My grandmother survived, because an American soldier refused to abandon her in a blizzard." The storm raged on, but the men kept marching, not because they were ordered to, but because this was who they were. The rescue station appeared not as a building, but as a faint glow, an amber smudge trembling through the storm. For hours the men had marched toward nothing but white, carrying weight that grew heavier only because hope kept it alive. Now, as they crested the final rise, the wind eased just enough for the shape to emerge. Low wooden walls, lanterns strung along the eaves, smoke trailing from a chimney that meant warmth, fire, survival. Sergeant Hale felt Greta stir weakly against him. "We're here," he whispered, though he wasn't sure she could hear. Behind him, the rest of the squad pushed forward, exhausted to the marrow, boots dragging through drifts that clung like hands. The women they carried were barely conscious, some not moving at all, others whispering in German, their words fragmented by cold and fear. Ilsa's fingers clutched Jensen's collar. Marta's head rested limply on Colin's shoulder. Every man had given far more than he had, yet still they did not stop. A medic burst from the doorway the moment they reached the porch. His face froze in astonishment. 12 women limp across American shoulders, their hair caked with snow, their breaths shallow clouds. "For God's sake, get them inside," he shouted. The soldiers staggered into the entry hall one by one, heavy boots thudding onto wooden floors. Heat enveloped them instantly, thick, almost painful after so many hours of cold. Lanterns cast golden circles of light across cots, blankets, and steaming pots of water. A potbelly stove burned fiercely in the center, radiating life. But the true shock came in what happened next. The medics didn't turn first to the frostbitten American soldiers. They didn't ask for rank. They didn't follow procedure. They rushed to the prisoners. "Lay them here," one medic ordered, clearing space. "Get blankets, the thick ones. Check their pulses. Ma'am, stay with me. Open your eyes. Good, good. Don't drift." An American private sprinted forward with wool blankets, covering Greta and Marta before Hale or Collins could adjust their grip. Another wrapped Ilsa so quickly that Jensen blinked in confusion. For a moment, the German women stared in disbelief, shivering, dazed, barely able to process that the hands lifting their chins, checking their pupils, warming their fingers were not punishers, but rescuers. Ilsa whispered, voice cracking, "They are helping us." Jensen knelt beside her as the medic examined her frostbitten toes. "Yeah," he said softly. "We're helping." "Why?" Her eyes were glassy, bewildered. "We are prisoners." He hesitated, searching her face. Prisoners don't stop being human. Greta, trembling violently beneath her blankets, looked up at Sergeant Hale. Her lips moved with effort. "You carried me. All that way." Hale nodded once. "Couldn't just leave you." "But why save us?" she breathed. "Why?" His voice was quiet but firm with conviction. "Because it's what decent people do." Her reaction wasn't a sob at first. It was a silent collapse, her face crumpling as if something deep and tightly wound inside her finally broke. Then the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic, but raw, shaking her shoulders, slipping down her cheeks in streaks that melted the frost still clinging to her skin. Marta suddenly grabbed Colin's sleeve. Her grip was weak but desperate. "They told us Americans would hurt us," she whispered. "They showed films, pictures, said you would laugh while we froze." Colin swallowed. They lied. Her tears spilled faster. Everything. Everything was a lie. Across the room, similar scenes unfolded. Women who had feared American cruelty now clung to American hands. Medics wrapped warm towels around numb limbs, fed the POWs spoonfuls of broth, rubbed life back into frozen fingertips. Blankets were tucked gently around shoulders, hot tea was lifted to trembling lips. Each act of care contradicted years of indoctrination. Each gentle touch pulled down another brick of propaganda. One POW looked around the room, voice trembling. "You should treat your own men first." A medic shook his head. "You're all in bad shape. We help whoever's closest to the edge." The statement hit her harder than the cold ever had. The German women had been raised on a story. America is cruel. America is brutal. America is your death. Now they were wrapped in American wool, fed American soup. Examined by American doctors who spoke softly and with genuine concern. Every gesture dismantled a lifetime of fear. Ilsa watched Jensen peel off his gloves, hands cracked, bleeding from carrying her, and she whispered something in German he couldn't understand. But he understood the tone, and it made him look away for a moment, suddenly humbled. He placed a tin cup of warm broth into her hands. "Drink, slow sips." She tried. Her fingers shook. He steadied the cup for her. She looked up at him, disbelief etched into every line of her face. "You saved us," she said. "No one ordered you to. You chose." He nodded. Some things aren't about orders. And in that simple sentence, an entire world view fractured. Hale stood at the foot of Greta's cot, watching color slowly return to her cheeks. A blanket wrapped her shoulders like a cocoon. She met his eyes and whispered, "I thought you would let the storm take us." He leaned in slightly. "We don't let storms take people if we can help it." Her expression softened, confusion melting into something like awe. "Is that America?" she asked. He held her gaze. "That's the America my mother raised me to believe in." Across the room, Marta clung to Colin's hand as if anchoring herself in a new reality. Another POW fell asleep mid-sip, trusting the warmth for the first time since capture. And the soldiers, exhausted, frostbitten, stiff with cold, finally allowed themselves to breathe. They stood or sat near the cots, watching over the women they had carried through death's door, as if they couldn't quite leave them yet. An America confident enough to show mercy. An America strong enough to choose compassion. An America certain that character mattered more than victory. As medics checked pulses and adjusted blankets, an unspoken question lingered in the warm lamplight. Does a nation like that still exist today? But for now, for this night, inside this small rescue station in Wyoming, 12 women learned that the enemy they feared most was the one who had just saved their lives. And the soldiers who saved them understood something too. Sometimes the greatest battles are won not with weapons, but with decency. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the bones of everyone who survived it. By the following morning, the rescue station stood wrapped in a soft hush, the kind that settles only after great danger has slipped away. Snow dripped from the eaves in slow, heavy beads. The stove crackled. Breath no longer froze in midair. Inside, the German women woke not to fear, but to warmth. Greta opened her eyes first. The wool blanket across her shoulders felt impossibly soft compared to the ice that had nearly claimed her. Sergeant Hale sat nearby, not hovering, not guarding, simply ensuring she was still breathing. When she stirred, he offered a small nod, almost shy. "You made it," he said. She swallowed, her voice rough. "Because of you." He didn't respond, but he didn't have to. The truth lay between them, quiet and undeniable. Ilse sat up in her cot with a start, eyes darting around, waiting for harsh commands that never came. Instead, Corporal Jensen appeared with a cup of warm water. "You're safe," he said gently. "Take your time." Her hands trembled as she accepted the cup. "Safe," she repeated, tasting the word as though it were foreign. "From the storm. And from you." His eyebrows knit together. "From everyone." She stared at him for a long moment, something in her chest loosening, something collapsing and rebuilding at the same time. Across the room, Marta apologized repeatedly for gripping Private Colin's arm the night before. He only laughed. "I didn't mind," he said. "It got cold. You kept my arm warm." She covered her face in embarrassment, but her shoulders shook with a laugh she didn't know she still possessed. Medics treated frostbite. Soldiers carried buckets of water. The women rested in cots pushed close to the fire, whispering among themselves in disbelief about what they had lived through and who had saved them. It was during this quiet recovery that Greta approached Lieutenant Harris with a request. She stood with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the blanket trailing behind her like a cape. Her voice trembled, but her eyes did not. "Sir," she said in halting English, "may I write a letter?" "A letter?" Harris asked. "To the family of Sergeant Hale." She swallowed. "I want to thank them for raising a son who saved my life. Hale, standing nearby, flushed deeply. You don't have to do that. Greta shook her head. I do. Harris smiled softly. We'll get you the paper. When Hale's mother received that letter months later in Nebraska, ink smudged by Greta's tears and ending with the sentence, Your son carried me when I could not walk, and because of him, I will live to see peace again. She sat down at her kitchen table and wept. Ilse returned to Germany after the war, carrying with her not just the memory of Wyoming's blizzard, but the memory of Jensen's coat around her shoulders and the words he had spoken when she asked why he would save an enemy. Because no one dies on our watch. Those words lit a strange spark in her. She applied to nursing school. She spent the rest of her life tending to the sick and elderly, especially those whom society forgot. When she told her grandchildren bedtime stories, she never spoke of battles or bombs. She spoke of 12 German women carried through a storm by American soldiers, and she always ended by saying, America saved my life in a blizzard. Greta became a school teacher again, but her lessons changed. She told her students that courage was not only found in the battlefield, it was found in mercy. She kept a photograph of the Wyoming mountains on her desk, though she never explained where it came from. Marta wrote a memoir, thin, modest, rarely purchased, about her captivity. Only one chapter mentioned the storm, but it was the chapter every scholar now cites. They were supposed to hate us. They were supposed to be cruel. But when death came for us, they lifted us onto their backs and carried us through the snow. And in that moment, the war had no meaning left. That sentence, years later, appeared in a footnote of an American historian's book. Then it appeared in a documentary script. Then in a museum placard. And, finally, in the digital age, it appeared in the comment section of a video shared by millions. In Nebraska, a woman typed, My grandfather served in the 11th Infantry. He always said the proudest moment of his service wasn't firing a shot, it was saving a group of German women in a snowstorm. In Munich, a young man replied, My grandmother survived because one of those American soldiers carried her on his back. Without him, I would not exist. Another reply came from Texas. This story is why I teach my kids that America wasn't great because it was perfect. It was great because decent people made hard choices. And someone else wrote the simplest truth of all. Thank you, America, for giving my family a future. The blizzard had cleared, leaving behind a world washed clean, a landscape of glittering white unmarred except for a single trail of boot prints leading from the forest. The women emerged slowly, bundled in coats, leaning on each other. Their faces were no longer masks of suspicion. They were open, softened by survival, marked by gratitude they didn't yet know how to voice. Greta approached Hale once more. You said Americans don't abandon people, she said. Yes, he replied. She touched her chest lightly. That saved us more than the fire. He said nothing, but something in his expression told her he understood. The trucks rumbled to life. Soldiers helped the women aboard, not pushing, not ordering, but supporting them gently as though guiding friends. As the convoy drove away, the snow-covered station shrank behind them. Yet the memory of that night grew larger with every mile, every year, every generation. Enemies survived together. Americans refused to abandon those in need. German women carried through a blizzard lived to tell their stories. And their descendants, tens of thousands across the world, carry that legacy in their blood. A legacy born not of victory, but of decency. The war ended, but the blizzard never truly left them. It lingered in memory, quiet of the war. But every winter, when the first snow fell thick across the fields, he would go quiet for a long moment. His wife noticed it before he ever explained. One Christmas, after the house had grown still, he finally told her, I once carried a woman I was supposed to hate. I carried her because if I hadn't, the storm would have taken her, and I couldn't come home to you knowing I'd let that happen. His wife took his hand and squeezed it. That sounds like the man I married. He wrote back to Greta once, only once, when her letter arrived after repatriation. He told her he hoped Germany rebuilt. He told her he hoped she became a teacher again. He told her he believed the next generation deserved peace. Greta kept that letter until she died. In Germany, the women rebuilt their lives with a quiet, humbled gratitude. Ilse became a nurse. For 40 years, she held the hands of the dying, remembering the American soldier who held hers in the snow. Every time a colleague asked why she never turned away a patient, even the belligerent, the hopeless, the forgotten, she answered, "Because someone once saved me when they had every reason not to." Marta published her memoir in 1964, but only a few dozen copies sold. Yet one of them ended up in the Wyoming State Archives. A librarian read the chapter about the blizzard and wept. She brought it to the director. The director brought it to a historian. The historian brought it to a museum. From there, the story grew wings. By the turn of the 21st century, the tale had become part of a larger conversation. Documentaries featured interviews with surviving family members. University courses discussed the moral courage of wartime America. Visitors stood quietly in a museum gallery where the Wyoming Winter Rescue exhibit told the story in photographs and fragments. And every visitor who read that story saw something they recognized, not in the faces of the soldiers or the POWs, but in themselves. They saw the America they wanted to believe in, the America they hoped still existed, the America that carried strangers through storms. One artifact became the centerpiece of the exhibit. A simple wool coat, frayed at the cuffs, mended once at the collar, buttons mismatched from cold season repairs. The color had faded after decades of storage, but the weight remained. Anyone who lifted it could feel the burden it once carried. A small plaque rested beneath it. Used to carry a German POW in the blizzard of '45. Visitors stared at it for long minutes. Some wiped tears from their cheeks. Some whispered stories of their fathers, grandfathers, uncles who had fought in the war. One elderly woman reached out with trembling hands, not touching the coat, just hovering near it, and whispered in German, "Danke." A museum guide asked if she had known one of the women. She shook her head. "No," she said softly. "I am here because I am alive, because of one of them." In time, schoolchildren visited the exhibit. Teachers explained how nations could fight fiercely, yet still choose mercy. How decency was a choice, not a resource that ran out, but a responsibility carried forward. Students wrote essays about the blizzard rescue, trying to capture what made that night different from every battle they had studied. One student wrote, "Maybe America was strongest when it was kindest." Another wrote, "If they could save their enemies, why can't we save each other?" A third wrote the line that every teacher remembered, "We need to find our way back to the country we were in that storm." Today, when this story is shared, online, in books, in documentaries, the comments reveal the true reach of its legacy. My grandmother survived thanks to white and vast, shaping the lives it had nearly claimed, and the nation whose sons had chosen compassion over survival. The 12 German women carried from the storm returned to a broken homeland. The American soldiers returned to farms, factories, and small towns that would soon hum with post-war life. But the night in Wyoming lived on in both countries, told in whispers at dinner tables, written between the lines of faded letters, and tucked into the private history of families who owed their existence to a decision made in the cold. For years, the story was nothing more than that. A memory. One act of mercy buried beneath millions of others in a world rebuilding itself. But legacies have a way of resurfacing, especially when their meaning becomes more valuable with time. In the decades that followed, America became a different place. The factories that once roared with the power of the arsenal of democracy fell silent. The unity born from shared sacrifice thinned into factions. Debates grew sharper. Neighbors drifted farther apart. The certainty that once defined the greatest generation faded into questions asked late at night. What happened to the country we inherited? Where did the clarity go? Would we still do the right thing if no one was watching? These questions did not trouble the soldiers of 1945. They had lived their answer, and slowly, decade by decade, the Blizzard story resurfaced, called forth by people who felt something in the present slipping away. It often began in the simplest way. A granddaughter asking why her grandmother kept an American coat wrapped in paper. A grandson wondering why his grandfather's war stories always circled back to a winter night in Wyoming. A historian reading a forgotten memoir with a single haunting chapter. This is the night I stopped fearing America. The tale spread, first through families, then through libraries, then through the early internet where strangers discovered they shared pieces of the same story. An American man from Kansas wrote, "My father served with the 11th Infantry. He said the blizzard was the moment he understood what America stood for." A German woman replied, "My grandmother was one of the POWs your father carried. Because of him, I am alive today." Someone else wrote, "If only we could be that America again." The comparison became impossible to ignore. America, 1945, a nation that believed strength meant protecting the vulnerable, even the enemy. A people who trusted that mercy could win hearts where bullets could not. A generation raised to believe that character was a more enduring weapon than steel. America today. Loud, divided, suspicious, weary from conflict that isn't fought on battlefields but in living rooms, online forums, and election seasons. A country that feels pulled apart by every argument, every headline. In that contrast, the story of 12 German POWs and a handful of frostbitten American soldiers grew more than historical. It grew symbolic, a reminder of the kind of nation America once knew how to be. This legacy lived strongest in the soldiers who returned home. Sergeant Hale married, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke to American soldiers. My father said the Blizzard rescue was the moment he knew what kind of man he wanted to be. My family owes everything to those boys from Wyoming. This is the America I still believe in. Let's be that country again. And so the story ends not where the Blizzard ended, but where its meaning began. In the hearts of those who remember. In 1945, a squad of frostbitten young Americans made a choice, not out of duty, not out of glory, but out of the quiet conviction that moral courage defines a nation more than victory ever could. They carried women who had been told they were monsters. They proved propaganda wrong with the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. They chose compassion when the world offered every excuse not to. They carried strangers. They carried enemies. They carried the better angels of their country. And as long as their story is told, as long as someone stands before that faded wool coat in Wyoming, its final truth endures. This is America at its best.